Neville Goddard is often introduced through phrases that sound predictive or dramatic. One such phrase is the idea that you are about to receive everything. Within his own framework, however, this statement is not a forecast about future events. It is a description of a particular internal orientation. Goddard was not focused on what would arrive next in time, but on how the mind positions itself in relation to what it wants. When he used language that suggests imminence, he was pointing to a psychological condition in which the sense of lack has already ended. In this model, about to receive does not describe a moment just before acquisition. It describes the mental point at which expectation dissolves into assumption. You are asked to notice that the phrase refers to a state of consciousness, not an outcome. The emphasis is not on arrival, but on completion. The question that remains open at the start of his system is whether the mind can occupy this position of completion without converting it into anticipation, excitement, or effort. Neville Goddard's core claim can be stated without embellishment. He argued that experience is organized from an internal assumption rather than from external events. In his view, what appears in experience is secondary to the position the mind has already taken. When he spoke of receiving, he meant an internal act of acceptance, not a physical transaction. The claim is not that the mind creates events directly, but that it determines how events are encountered and interpreted. You are asked to consider that, within this framework, the decisive moment occurs when the mind stops treating a desire as unresolved. Goddard describes this as a shift from wanting to having understood psychologically. Once this shift occurs, the mind no longer relates to the subject as open-ended. The system does not promise results. It proposes an internal logic. Experience follows the structure of assumption already in place. Whether this logic corresponds to external change is left as an open question within the model. For Neville Goddard's model to function, a specific assumption must be accepted. The assumption is that internal receipt precedes any recognition of fulfillment. This does not mean that physical circumstances immediately change. It means that the mind must stop relating to the object as missing. In this framework, receiving is defined as psychological closure. You are asked to notice that this differs from belief or hope. Belief can coexist with doubt, and hope implies postponement. Assumption, as Goddard uses the term, implies settlement. The mind behaves as though the issue is resolved. The model assumes that without this internal resolution, experience will continue to be interpreted through the lens of absence. This assumption is not defended as fact. It is treated as a functional requirement of the system. If the mind continues to expect, it has not yet assumed. The tension in the model lies in whether such internal closure can occur independently of external confirmation. Neville Goddard's explanation relies on a basic psychological observation. Unresolved matters occupy attention. Resolved matters recede from focus. In his framework, feeling is not emotion, but the sense of being in a state. To assume something is to feel it as already settled. You are asked to observe that this feeling does not require excitement or intensity. It requires familiarity. When the mind accepts a condition as given, it stops monitoring it. Goddard suggests that imagination is the tool through which this acceptance is rehearsed, but imagination itself is secondary. What matters is the resulting sense of normality. Once the assumed state feels ordinary, attention disengages. The mechanism is not mystical. It follows a common cognitive pattern. Attention decreases when uncertainty ends. The unresolved issue is whether this internal change affects only subjective experience or whether it also influences what later appears as external events. Within Neville Goddard's system, discipline is not defined as effortful concentration. It is defined as the avoidance of contradiction. Once an assumption is accepted, discipline consists of not reintroducing the sense of absence. You are asked to notice how easily the mind revisits unresolved questions. In this framework, repetition is used not to force belief, but to stabilize a position until it feels settled. Attention is guided away from outcomes and back to the internal conclusion already selected. This does not mean suppressing doubt through force. It means recognizing doubt as a signal that the assumption has not yet stabilized. Goddard's emphasis on attention reflects a broader psychological insight. What the mind repeatedly entertains becomes familiar, and what is familiar feels real. The discipline described here is passive rather than active. The challenge is whether such restraint can be maintained without turning into constant self-monitoring. Neville Goddard's model proposes an internal sequence rather than a mechanical cause and effect chain. In his view, consciousness sets the conditions under which experience is interpreted. The internal state does not push events into existence. It frames how events are encountered. You are asked to consider that within this logic, causation is reversed from common assumptions. Instead of experience determining belief, belief determines the meaning of experience. When inner receipt has occurred, subsequent events are no longer evaluated as tests or signs. They are encountered neutrally. The model claims coherence rather than proof. If the mind treats something as resolved, it will stop acting as though it is pending. This alters behavior, perception, and interpretation. Whether this alteration produces consistent external patterns is not asserted as guaranteed. The internal logic holds regardless. Assumption precedes interpretation, and interpretation shapes lived experience. Neville Goddard's ideas did not emerge in isolation. Across history, many philosophical systems have emphasized inner completion before external clarity. Stoic thought, for example, emphasized internal assent over external conditions. Certain strands of idealist philosophy placed consciousness prior to appearance. Goddard's contribution was to translate these patterns into psychological language accessible to a modern audience. His terminology differs, but the structure is familiar. The idea that internal resolution stabilizes perception appears repeatedly across cultures and eras. You are asked to notice that such models persist despite differing metaphysical explanations. This persistence suggests that they describe a recurring feature of human cognition rather than a single doctrine. Goddard's framework fits within this lineage by focusing on assumption as a mental act. The unresolved question is why the idea of inner first organization continues to reappear, even when its explanatory claims remain contested. In Neville Goddard's framework, perception is never neutral. Experience is filtered through the assumptions already in place. When something is treated as unresolved, perception searches for confirmation or contradiction. When something is treated as settled, perception relaxes. You are asked to consider how often experience is shaped by what the mind expects to find. Goddard's model does not deny external reality. It argues that reality is encountered through interpretation. Inner receipt changes the filter, not necessarily the environment. Events may remain the same, but their meaning shifts. This shift can produce the impression of change without requiring immediate alteration of circumstances. The model remains agnostic about ultimate reality. Its focus is functional. How does assumption affect perception? The answer, within the system, is that assumption determines what stands out, what is ignored, and what feels significant. Agency, in Neville Goddard's system, is not defined as control over outcomes. It is defined as the selection of an internal conclusion. You are asked to notice that responsibility is placed at the level of assumption, not action. Action may continue, but it is no longer driven by anticipation. The individual is responsible for where the mind settles, not for managing every external variable. This reframes effort as unnecessary once assumption is complete. The model does not deny uncertainty. It proposes that uncertainty loses its psychological grip when the internal position is fixed. Agency becomes quieter and less visible. The tension here is whether this form of agency feels sufficient. Without anticipation, motivation appears different. The model suggests that action emerges naturally from the assumed state, but it does not claim that action guarantees results. At its endpoint, Neville Goddard's framework resolves into cognitive stillness. The mind is no longer oriented toward receiving, achieving, or waiting. The internal act of receipt has already occurred. Attention disengages because there is nothing left to resolve. You are asked to understand this structure without accepting it as true or false. The model can be examined as a coherent system of thought. It explains how imagination, feeling, and assumption interact to stabilize perception. It does not require belief to be understood. It requires only recognition of its internal logic. When viewed this way, the phrase, "You are about to receive everything," loses its dramatic tone. It becomes a technical description of a mind that has ended expectation. What remains is not a promise, but a structure. Understanding that structure is the conclusion of the system itself.